the ideal state for the GraphQL world is that you send one request to get all of the data that you need on the page of that client.
But I think the adoption story and a lot of the advocates outside of the core team were really big on this idea of GraphQL is the universal API. So if you support GraphQL, you support everything. And that's why we saw whole companies and frameworks betting everything on building this wall for applications that have 2 developers and 10 users.
From our perspective, the power of GraphQL is that every single GraphQL API has that same schema definition. So we can build edge caching once, and it'll work for any GraphQL API.
Howdy.
Can you hear me?
Almost.
Nope.
Now you can.
All right, perfect. What's up, y'all? I'm B-Dougie-Yo on the internet. You can call me Brian if that's easier. And super happy to talk about actually the sort of host and sort of guide this conversation between tRPC and GraphQL. I've had experience in both. tRPC recently and GraphQL since 2016. So, but I'll try to limit my expertise. And
We'll see about that.
Yeah. But actually, we could start, why don't we do just some quick intros and what your relationship with these technologies are. Let's go with Max first.
Sure, I'm Max. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Stellate. We build GraphQL tooling for companies that use GraphQL in production. I am a software engineer by background. I've done a lot of open source work in the JavaScript, React ecosystem, largely co-created style components, React boilerplate, a whole bunch of stuff. And I'm really excited to be here today.
Excellent. Theo?
Howdy, I'm Theo, T3.gg on most things. I worked at Twitch for a while, helped us move to GraphQL there, funny enough. I since have become well known for my love of all things full stack, type safety, TypeScript, tRPC especially. I'm CEO and co-founder of a company, Ping.gg, basically building Zoom for streamers, make it easier for content creators to do live collaborations. And I spend way too much time debugging everything and anything that can go wrong in full stack web application development. So excited for the combo.
Perfect. Yeah, and I guess I should just say I run a company called OpenSauce.pizza. That's the URL, and we do insights into open source projects. My connection to GraphQL was actually, I worked at GitHub for a while, and also worked at Netlify early and toyed around with a lot of GraphQL then. And then most recently, we started building a new project for open source, and we prototyped a lot of tRPC things, very quickly, which is, I guess we can start off can you explain tRPC for folks who maybe not be watching your YouTube?
Absolutely. So obviously watch the YouTube if you haven't yet. It's a great channel, put a lot of work into that. The TLDR of tRPC is rather than defining an API layer as a schema of some form, be it a GraphQL schema that describes how queries are shaped or a REST open API spec that describes the shape of every piece of data every endpoint can return. Instead, you write functions and you call them. That's what the RPC stands for. It's remote procedure call. You write a server function that fetches some data from a database or calls an authorized API on your server. And then the client can just call that directly through a proxy. So you type trpc.user.whatever endpoint you define there, .useQuery, and you get your loading state, your error state, your data, and type safety back to front. And if you go to the back end and make changes, you don't even have to save the file for the type safety to be honored because there's no code gen, there's no hidden layer behind the scenes that creates the type safety. The type safety is through the function that you're calling. So if you change the values of what that function returns, you'll see the errors on the client if they don't line up anymore. It's the fastest I've ever been able to move in development. It both gives me the client-side wins of GraphQL, where I can have really good loading states and error states and type safety without bringing the code gen and the complexity of creating a GraphQL server. It's all just functions in the end, and it's really powerful in that way.
Cool. Max, do you want to explain GraphQL to us and share some benefits as well?
I'll be honest, I'm kind of nervous to be sitting here because Lee Byron's sitting in the front row who created GraphQL. So, exactly.
Lee, can you sit in the back, please?
So, GraphQL is essentially a spec that lets you define the shape of your data. And they wrote a smart algorithm on the server that resolves that as efficiently as possible. And really, the thing about GraphQL that most people call out as the main benefit is that it makes data fetching incredibly pleasant. Now, I will say, compared to tRPC, to jump ahead a little bit, there's certainly a lot more overhead because you're defining that central schema that defines which data you have and how that is related to each other, which is really the graph part. You're defining the relations. And that comes with advantages and disadvantages, which I'm sure we're going to get into. But I've been using GraphQL for many, many years and loving it. And so obviously now built a company around it. So very excited to be here.
Yeah, and I guess we can just continue on this path. So, Max, you run a company that actually does tooling for GraphQL. So can we talk about like what does it take to set up a GraphQL server and start using it in production?
Sure. I think the two pieces that any GraphQL API really needs are the schema, which defines, again, the shape of the data, and then the resolvers, which define how to resolve that data. So you'll have a user type, and then you have to tell the GraphQL server how to actually get a user. And then maybe that user has a relation to posts, and so you'll have to tell the server how to resolve a user's posts, et cetera, et cetera. You can imagine how that comes together. And a lot of big companies use GraphQL with a lot of their much related data, right? You can imagine if you look at GitHub's GraphQL API or Shopify's GraphQL API, they have thousands, if not tens of thousands of types and fields in there that's all related to each other. And then from the client, you can kind of query that really nicely with this query language, GraphQL query language. And you can resolve all those relations really nicely and sort of send the ideal state for the GraphQL world is that you send one request to get all of the data that you need on the page of that client. In practice, most people don't use GraphQL that way. But
The Twitch homepage has about 7 waterfalls after I optimized it, so
yep.
for reference.
Yep. But that's sort of the ideal state and where you can get with GraphQL if you set up the client-side tooling correctly.
Yeah, and we did allude to Lee. Lee was one of the co-creators at Facebook for GraphQL. So just wanted to mention that for folks who did not get that. But also, GraphQL, it started as a protocol. I remember actually sitting at the first GraphQL summit over in the dog patch and like started being like, oh, wow, this is amazing. I should try to build something with this. And I did, but never went to production. But that's besides the point. So what I'm getting at is like the prescribed way for GraphQL doesn't exist. Is that correct?
GraphQL itself is just a specification that defines how to write the schema, and then there's a reference implementation for how the resolvers basically fetch the data, but that's the extent of it. A lot of the tooling around it that you need to define the server, to define the clients, the code gen that Theo mentioned, has all been built by either Facebook and open sourced or by the community, and by the open source community there's many different implementations with various trade-offs, but a lot of it is around that central specification, which is really the core of GraphQL.
Yeah, I'd love to ask some questions about schema stuff in particular, just to like ground the direction here. I very strongly believe GraphQL's strength is the schema itself, and a lot of the value it brings is that specific like asset and artifact in your code base that represents the state of the API and everything that can be done on it. I'm curious specifically, how valuable do you think the schema is in terms of the benefit that GraphQL gives you, and where do you think the role is for generated schemas versus ones made by hand by the developers of the APIs?
It's an interesting question. At Stellate, just to give some context as well, we were originally called GraphCDN. We're essentially a gateway that does a bunch of stuff for GraphQL APIs. You can put us in front of any GraphQL API. We do edge caching, we do metrics. We're going to come out with rate limiting soon. We basically build tooling on that gateway layer. And from our perspective, the power of GraphQL is that every single GraphQL API has that same schema definition. So we can build edge caching once, and it'll work for any GraphQL API, right? We can just analyze the response. We can look at the type name field and the ID fields. We can tag responses. It's really powerful to have that schema. At the same time, the schema adds a lot of overhead, which is, I think, where tRPC really shines. Mm-hmm. And I think really I kind of had to laugh when I saw the title of this panel of GraphQL versus tRPC, because to me, it's really much less of a versus than when is it the right trade-offs for you to choose, right? Like when does which technology have the trade-offs that you need? And I think to me, the beauty of tRPC, to completely jump to the other side, is that you can really, really quickly, like Theo said, fetch the data that you need from the client without a lot of overhead. When you have the constrained setup of being ideally in a monorepo with a backend and a frontend written in TypeScript. For that specific paved path, it's a beautiful, very fast way to actually have data on the backend, get it on the client, render it, and you're done. It's beautiful. And I think where GraphQL shines to me and where the use cases are where it makes sense are really in situations when you have multiple clients, multiple teams, multiple backend microservices in different languages. That's really where GraphQL is really powerful, because you can have that central schema that everybody has access to, but then how that data is resolved, which team is responsible for which microservice to actually get the user type or the post type or the movie type or whatever is completely up to you, and what language that microservice is written in is also completely up to you. So anyways.
Yeah, we're trying to make it spicy, right? But you just completely watered this.
Sorry. Yeah.
But go ahead, Theo.
Yeah, this is the route where it's going to be like fully aligned in all of these things. I'm trying to like poke and find things, but I just feel like we're all going to be poking at Hasura together otherwise. Yeah, I think that like the value of GraphQL that's so misunderstood is the schema itself. Like the schema is a huge thing to adopt. It is effort to put in. That's not a flaw in GraphQL. It's the strength of GraphQL. The reason I introduced GraphQL into code bases is I have a team of people who make a service and a team of people who want to read from the service. and they don't get along. Either they're on different sides of the country and they don't have meetings together that go well, or there's a lot of disagreement and like things shifting in the structure of the API. And if I sit those two teams in a room and they bicker at each other for an hour and a schema comes out of it, they can fuck off, go other directions, do their own thing for a while, and by the time I come back and plug it all in, either it works or somebody gets fired. And that's the magic of GraphQL. It solves a team structure problem better than any other technology I've seen. And when you have that team problem, when you have things like ownership splitting up your code base in different repos in different places and different clients that don't talk to other teams, GraphQL is an incredible solution. I find that so many projects, even at big companies, aren't there or aren't there yet. Even at a big company like when I was at Twitch, not every service needed to have 15 different clients consuming it yet. Maybe we were adding a new feature, we were just going to add it to web, we're not sure if it's going to do well yet or not. Putting the extra effort into building that into the GraphQL API when we could stub out something really quick with tRPC, test it with our users, figure out if it works or not, and then put it into the GraphQL API once we've determined it is, that power and flexibility is something that people seem almost eager to give up without reason. And that's the frustration I have, why I'm almost seen as anti-GraphQL now. When I do love the solution, I just think you need to have those problems for the adoption to make sense.
Totally. I actually think, sorry to interrupt, I actually think that one of the, I know there's a lot of smart builders in this room watching right now, and hopefully also remotely. There's a lot of innovation that can still happen in that in-between state. When your tRPC is great and GraphQL is great, but when the trade-off starts making sense for GraphQL or for tRPC is very undefined. And I think there's a lot of innovation that can happen to enable businesses or people to build things really quickly, but then also move into that schema gradually as they need it, right? I think there's a world in which that's possible. Nobody's built it yet, but I think
I largely agree. I don't know if that's like a thing that needs to be built or a thing that needs to be demonstrated. Like in the end, the beauty of tRPC is it is just functions, and I can take the functions I defined in my tRPC endpoints, export them separately, and then call those same exact functions in the one GraphQL endpoint in my Next.js code base for the mobile app that refuses to use anything but GraphQL. I'm able to write a function and then resolve that in 3 different places and have a relatively good experience. But I think like the benefit of tRPC and the thing I really like try to advocate is that it is the most simple subset of an API, and almost everything you write for tRPC, you can copy paste into any other solution, add whatever that solution requires on top. Going from tRPC to GraphQL is a relatively pleasant experience. Going from GraphQL to anything else is nightmarish.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll let you take a drink, but I need you to sell us on tRPC a bit more, because you're currently selling us on GraphQL, but you started an entire company and you're using tRPC under the hood as well.
Yeah.
Can you explain the experience and how you sort of scaled your team?
Absolutely. The value that the reason we went to tRPC was I was writing I was using a Next.js project, had an API directory with like 18 different endpoints that were like 10 line of code functions with 30 plus lines of validation to make sure the request and the response were in the right shapes. No type safety at all, being called in React query use queries all over my code base. And it was just getting really annoying to deal with. I wrote a proposal for a custom hook called use backend query, where you'd write backend code in your component, and it would get compiled out to an endpoint that would then be replaced with a React query call. Was really excited about this proposal. I showed it to Tanner Lindsley in a Twitter space, the creator of React Query. He's like, oh, that's really cool. I heard about these 2 projects. One's called Blitz.js, and the other's called tRPC. I think they're both doing something similar with React Query. You should go check those out. And I did, and I was so blown away with tRPC. I didn't get it when I looked at it first. Like, none of this makes any sense. Then I installed it in my code base. The docs were awful at the time, but I worked my way through it, and immediately was able to just delete 2/3 of the code from my endpoints, and whenever I made a change, autocomplete would guide it. And that was the magic aha moment for me. It was the first time I typed tRPC.useQuery, and it auto-completed the name of the endpoint and then gave me a type error because I didn't actually have, I thought I had a string for the date time, but I actually had a date time because tRPC has super JSON, so it can serialize things that JSON can't. So I literally would just return a user object from my backend in a function, type useQuery, auto-complete the name of that endpoint, and get the data in my client. Nothing will beat that. The reason that GraphQL is something like I would consider a move to is that the actual function that the front end is calling isn't in the same code base. If I'm able to have one code base or one monorepo where the front end can directly import from the back end, it's really hard to justify putting a wall between the two. And that's what I see when I look at GraphQL. I see a wall between the back end and the front end, and it's a beautifully architected wall, or it's a mess if you're not, like, I don't want to keep saying Hasura, but write your own backends, write your own schemas. The beauty of GraphQL is building that wall and building the specific ins and outs for it, for both sides, so that everything's always moving correctly. tRPC is destroying that wall because you don't need it yet.
Is it easy as a time where in the future that ping?
Yeah, every tRPC user should aspire for the code base they're working in to get to a point where it's irresponsible to use tRPC. Like, your goal as a tRPC user should be for the thing you're building in it to be successful enough and long-lived enough and need to grow enough that you're down to move off tRPC and move to something else. Like, by the time ping's at a point where we're hiring mobile engineers to write things in Kotlin and Swift, I think at that point we'd probably have to bite the bullet and move to GraphQL. But until we are there, it just doesn't make any sense for us to slow ourselves down for the sake of it.
Yeah, and I think it's clear, like, if the business calls for it, choose it. But sometimes it sounds like we can sometimes over-index on optimizing or using the latest and greatest. But I want to ask you a question about, because you built an entire company around GraphQL. Is the GraphQL ecosystem moving fast enough?
Is the GraphQL ecosystem moving fast enough?
I mean, it's been around for a while, and there's some things that have been like still pie in the sky ideas that still don't, like, I think Apollo has federation, and I remember back in the day, like before federation, schema stitching was like a magical thing that I tried to do lots of times, and this could never get it to work. Caching was a thing that I could never get to work. It exists in the libraries now today, but I've been removed. I just want to know your take. Like, you built an entire company around this, so.
Well, I certainly hope we're innovating fast enough.
Yes.
That's
sure.
ultimately what I need to do as a company. But I think the interesting thing about the GraphQL ecosystem is that largely a lot of the adoption, for the reasons that Theo and I mentioned, largely a lot of the adoption happens at large scale. Largely a lot of the adoption happens at the enterprise scale, which is something that we got to really credit as an ecosystem Apollo for. I don't know if anyone, if you haven't heard of Apollo, Apollo GraphQL is the biggest company in the GraphQL space. And they realized early on that the problems that GraphQL solves are really most valuable at large scale. And so they work with all these enterprises and help them move their usually mess of HTTP endpoints. I don't even want to say REST APIs, because usually they're just HTTP endpoints that return some JSON. We've spoken with companies that told us that they have thousands of HTTP endpoints that return random JSON. Nobody knows which endpoints exist. Nobody knows what they do, which endpoint they should use. And so they just end up adding more and more endpoints all the time. All the clients teams, they're like, oh, we need some data here. Yeah, let me just add a new endpoint and then return some random JSON again. And you end up with a mess of a system that just slows you down, because every single client keeps re-implementing how they fetch data, which makes no sense. And so that's kind of where GraphQL really shines, because you define that central layer of which data exists and how to resolve it. And then the teams that own that can optimize that however they want, and the clients can fetch whatever data they want. I forgot what the question was. Yeah. But
I was asking if GraphQL was moving fast enough.
Yeah, sorry, I completely ran down the rabbit hole. But essentially, so a lot of the large companies use GraphQL, and a lot of the players in the market, like us, the Guild, GraphBase, Hasura, are building a lot of open source tooling around GraphQL to make it nicer to use fundamentally.
Yeah. So I wanted to lead into a bit of more of the controversy, and we can sort of speak to it, like that's been happening on Twitter. I don't know why I don't know if you know, maybe it was like a video you created, but there was like some GraphQL versus tRPC conversations like in the last like 2 weeks.
I have a lot of theories on like why this keeps happening. I think the big problem, and it also goes back to the last question of like why, or like, is GraphQL moving fast enough? I think the problem I see is that GraphQL was very overprescribed and thrown in a lot of places it doesn't make sense. GraphQL is not an alternative to SQL. GraphQL is not a way to read from file systems. GraphQL is not a generic compiler to give you access to every API ever made. GraphQL is not the best way to access your old WordPress site. GraphQL is not a great way to move fast as a small startup. GraphQL is a great way for your big company to define a single endpoint that has a specific way you hit it and fulfill data requests to it. Because GraphQL started being shoved into all these other things, one of those things which tRPC excels at, which is small teams solving problems back end to front end, it's seen as like a versus type thing. The same way, like I just did a video that's really controversial. It's don't learn Rust, because I see a lot of TypeScript developers being told they should learn Rust because that's the future of web dev, which suggests you don't understand TypeScript, Rust, web, or dev. It's incredibly frustrating, and I see a lot of these false dichotomies coming out of misuse, and that's what I see. The people who put Rust in the browser are the same people who put GraphQL in their SQL, they're trying to prove that their thing can do everything, and I think all of them are wrong. And if I sit here and say tRPC can do everything, I'd hope you'd say to me the same. You're wrong. Don't use it for microservice communication. Don't use it for public APIs. Don't use it for, honestly, most of what Dougie's doing here. Like all of the stuff that they're doing at open source, they want public APIs. tRPC is such a close API, I wouldn't even let another team use it. And that's the value that it brings. I think, and I'm curious what your thoughts are here, that we basically lost 5 years of sentiment and GraphQL development to people pursuing putting it in stupid places.
Yeah, for sure. I think you hit the nail on the head there for the use case that GraphQL solves. What's interesting, I say that with sort of the ideological perspective of where GraphQL excels. At the same time, we see a surprising number of people using Stellate in front of pre-made GraphQL APIs, say WordPress GraphQL, say Hasura, say GraphBase, say whatever else you can come up with. We see a lot of usage there. And for the purposes that those businesses have, do they need GraphQL? Probably not, but it works great for them, right? They're kind of fine. They can fetch the WordPress data from the client, they can build their Gatsby next website for it, and it's fine. Is it the right solution for that problem? I don't know. But from an ecosystem perspective, we see just a lot of uptick of that, which tells me that there's something there.
I think that's the point that I specifically disagree on. There's a lot of technology that's being adopted for a lot of cool things that was still designed poorly at its core. One of my favorite examples here is Flutter. There are things Flutter can be used for that are decent, like animation frameworks. Like I saw it's a company that's building a whole animation studio through Flutter. Makes a lot of sense for that because Flutter's a rendering engine. It's not an application framework. But since you can technically build an app in it if you screenshot enough Apple UI elements and render them in enough different permutations, people started using a game engine to make apps, and it's a nightmare. There are companies who are successfully shipping apps that work on top of that, but if we had had a better conversation 5 years ago about why React Native isn't as scary as they think, and why the things they think React Native is scary for are actually problems with Flutter, then we wouldn't see these problems. And I think that where we're at with GraphQL is it was sold as, I don't even want to say it was sold as, I don't fault any of the core GraphQL team. I think their messaging has always been clear from day one, but I think the adoption story and a lot of the advocates outside of the core team were really big on this idea of GraphQL is the universal API. So if you support GraphQL, you support everything. And that's why we saw whole companies and frameworks betting everything on building this wall for applications that have 2 developers and 10 users.
I mean, that was a really good clip right there. We should definitely clip that and put that on TikTok for sure.
It was a little long for TikTok. I still haven't figured out that platform.
I figured out we should talk. But so, yeah, I mean, I actually come from a space where, so I worked at GitHub and worked really closely with that team. And specifically some of the tweets I wanted to call out is there was some sort of, I guess, wax poetic from Marc-Andre Giraud, who I don't know where he's at now.
I love Mark. He's at Netflix now, I think.
At Netflix? Yeah, okay, yeah. So he spent time at Shopify doing GraphQL. He spent time at GitHub doing GraphQL. And there was this, I don't know, what's your opinion of the GitHub GraphQL API?
Can I let Max go first?
Well, I talked to Max earlier, and he said he actually didn't use the GitHub GraphQL API.
The way I refer to the tRPC versus GraphQL versus REST is where are each strongest? tRPC is strongest when the backend is being consumed by the people who made it. GraphQL is consumed best when the backend and service creators work at the same company as the people consuming it, but they're not necessarily on the same team, and there may be some amount of friction between the teams in the way they communicate. REST is great when there are 2 different companies and 2 different entirely separate entities that are the ones who are consuming and providing the service. I have yet to find a good experience using external GraphQL APIs. I've put this challenge up a handful of times. I'll tweet it again. If people have a good example of a public GraphQL API, tweet it at me. I'd love to take a look. The GitHub one is a really weird experience. It's very easy to add one field and get a 500 for no reason. And it's just GraphQL makes the maintenance story, the debugging story, and the consumption story really weird if the people who built that thing aren't around for you to bug some amount. And there isn't a dedicated owner who understands both sides. You mentioned Mark. One of Mark's good friends, who's a homie of mine, Tony Gita, he was responsible for helping move Twitch over to GraphQL. And I was the one front end at the company that would sit and talk to the person building the schema. That's how we got so close. The amount of work someone like him has to put in to make that work and make it work well is astounding. And the only reason it could work is the effort he put in to talk to the main users of the thing and understand both sides as well as possible. I don't think it's possible to do at the scale of a public-facing API, and I think the boring standard nature of properly designed REST and Open API Swagger docs is something that is actually valuable in those cases, but slows you down on any smaller scale.
I think that's an interesting point. I think the public API that I probably admire the most is Shopify's, who have a really good story around documentation. They invest a lot of time in making sure that a lot of the GraphQL APIs, they're kind of like, here's the schema, good luck. But Shopify actually invested a lot of time into making sure they build a real developer portal. They give you real examples. It's like they line out the use cases. Just basic documentation things that you think would exist anyway. But they really spend a bunch of time, and their API is beautifully designed and doesn't break. I think GitHub's GraphQL API is...
Exactly.
It exists.
It does. I mean, the story behind it is like they were just early adopters, and I think it goes back to the people who built it aren't around anymore. And so I know Tony because I was early at GitHub and also talked to Tony a ton about GraphQL at some like random GraphQL hangouts here in the city. But it really comes down to like I don't think GitHub has kept up to date, and I think it used to be a really good premier solution to like look at GraphQL in the public, and now it isn't anymore. And I wish GitHub, talking to you, would invest more time in that. That's all I have to say about that.
I agree.
It was cool to adopt GraphQL when it was like the hot new growing thing, which is why I think we saw a lot of companies like GitHub adopting it, because there was people who were excited and wanted to like show off their excitement for it. And that was part of a curve. Now the only reason to make a public GraphQL API is because you're trying to push that curve back up because it is dropped. The interest in a new project, a newer developer or new system adopting GraphQL early is just like at zero now. You adopt GraphQL when you have a problem GraphQL solves, not because you're starting something new that GraphQL theoretically could be the API layer for. And I think that a lot of companies adopted GraphQL for their public APIs before we had this realization in the community. And there was real inertia for a while. There was a vibe. Actually, I'll poll the audience. Who here thought that GraphQL would replace REST at some point over the last 10 years? Yeah, that's what I thought. And this is the mistake. Yeah, this is the problem that I think GraphQL got itself into, was the community assumption that it would go way further and replace more things than it ever made sense to.
I think I'll double click on that public API nuance because I do think that from a client perspective, querying a GraphQL API when it works, when it doesn't break, when you add a field, is much nicer than having to hit 5 different endpoints. So from a pure consumption perspective from the client, it definitely has advantages. But for a public API, you then have to take into account the maintenance overhead that you have on the server, because suddenly somebody could be sending a query that's 5,000 fields and types, and you're fetching way too much data, and then the backend is overloaded, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of work that has to go into actually making that usable. Okay. But I think when it's well done, like the Shopify GraphQL API, I think from an experience perspective from the client, it does work more nicely than a REST API does.
I just realized the pushback I was going to give is literally what your company does. I was going to say one of the cool things about 5 REST endpoints is you can cache all 5 responses in the CDN. It's crazy that somebody's actually working on that problem for GraphQL.
Yeah, sign up for Stellate. And I was going to actually mention that, because I worked at GitHub, I was a heavy consumer of the GitHub GraphQL API, and I would just use it in every situation. So I was part of the problem, because every one of my examples were like, here's a cool thing you could do. So I spent a lot of time doing like persistent queries to like embed tokens inside of my fetch from the API. And then the original version of open source was all built 100% GraphQL API, GitHub. And it worked pretty well for a long time.
Yeah. And again, as I've said, like GraphQL makes a lot of sense if the person who made the API and the person who are consuming it are at the same company. I think you are as close as you could get without actually being at the same company when you're consuming the GraphQL endpoint.
100%. Yeah, so I mean, if we could just quickly summarize about the comparison between GraphQL and tRPC. I know that it's not a true comparison, but like, remind us what is good about tRPC that is not good in GraphQL?
I don't like the like good versus bad for this. I really see it as like small, medium, large, where like you should always use the smallest thing you can because it will be the fastest you can move. When you introduce GraphQL to your stack, you will move slower unless you're already on that outside layer and you could be like in further. Generally speaking, it's our responsibility as engineers to make things as simple as possible to solve the job so that they can be iterated on better, they can deliver faster, they can be replaced easier, and they can be understood quicker by future developers. If you're not doing that in your design, you're failing your users some amount. And I think when I think about GraphQL versus tRPC, what I'm asking myself is, can I possibly use tRPC for this thing? And if the answer is no, that's irresponsible, we have problems that tRPC doesn't solve, awesome, look at GraphQL. And if that doesn't work either because you have problems that it doesn't solve, okay, fine, I'll go back to Rust. But start from the simplest possible core, which honestly is using something like Astro to async whatever data and render that in your markup. But as soon as you want to do something more complex like a mutation or data updating like on the client, okay, tRPC React query makes a lot of sense. Wait, but I have a client that's in a different language, or the server is going to be in a different endpoint or a different repo. Then GraphQL makes more sense. But always try to be the simplest you can be and take steps out as you run into problems that your simple solution can't solve.
Kind of summarizes for GraphQL as well.
That's a beautiful summary.
Yeah, I wanted that real quick time check. I don't know if this timer is till Q&A or until we're done completely. Probably should have asked that before we started. Total time? All right, I've got some, I guess, more spicier questions. And then we can go to Q&A. You worked at Gatsby for like a short amount of time?
A year or two.
A year or two? What's wrong with that solution? Sorry, Gatsby basically it embedded GraphQL inside of its solution. Maybe
That's a spicy question for sure.
It is a spicy question. I don't know if we can just edit this out after. But.
I could do the harsh for you a bit, but I think that I'm going to start with where I think it makes a lot of sense. The thing Gatsby was trying to do was be the easiest way to rewrite whatever old like Drupal or WordPress or whatever website you had existed and get the data out in a standardized way. If the goal was to have like a single query like layer that you can write a website template for, and for it, with as few lines of code as possible, make that template work on whatever random source of data and CMS you have is. GraphQL was a good enough way to plug in both sides, and it did make a lot of sense for that at the time. If one of those sides is a better API or a file system, I think you're going to feel a lot of pain. And what we ended up seeing is companies realizing even a GraphQL layer on top of WordPress isn't as good as a proper CMS that thinks about your experience as a developer every day, which is why we see the current like CMS boom. Like how many CMSs were there at Jamstack? I counted 6, and I think there were
all
more.
the sponsors were headless CMSs.
Headless CMS is like the cool new thing because it turned out that a generic GraphQL endpoint on top of old CMSs was not enough to provide a good experience. It's better than nothing, and I think that it got over-adopted because we were too used to nothing. And that's what I see when I look at the Gatsby GraphQL implementation.
Yeah, I think Gatsby's strength is ultimately that they have this plugin system where you can install the WordPress GraphQL plugin, the file system plugin, the whatever other API plugin that you want. They have a plugin for literally everything. And you get one graph for all of your data. And you can actually query it kind of nicely from the client. You can build your website with it, and it works beautifully. I think the downside, the trade-off is that you introduce a lot of complexity into your system because you suddenly have all these random plugins that do random things, and if one of them breaks, it's really, really hard to debug. And so I think Gatsby is great for use cases when you have that legacy data, when you have 5 different APIs that you got to combine. You just install the 5 plugins, and it'll probably work just great to build your website with.
Yeah, I honestly think like Gatsby would have been much stronger if they focused all in on that. If they were trying to be a way to merge these chaotic sources of data in a single like queryable layer, that's a problem that like. And this is the thing I see whenever I see people adopting GraphQL weird places. Usually, what I see is a lot of bad decisions around what actually solves problems. And what I see when I look at Gatsby is an attempt to solve the generic problem of my WordPress site is slow. That went down 3 bad paths to get there, merged all of them together, and calls it a framework.
All right. Another question. We'll go to questions from other people, but I'm going to name 3 libraries. I need to tell me which one to use. So we got Apollo, we got URQL, we got Relay. Which one do I use?
What about URQL?
URQL. You don't call it URQL?
Is that what it is? Cool.
URQL.
Yeah.
I've always said URQL. It
URQL?
just reads that way.
Yeah, I say URQL as well.
Cool. I'll say URQL in the future.
So Relay lets you use GraphQL in the way GraphQL is intended to use, which is it combines all your data into one query, it sends it to the server.
And requires you to have 2 PhD holders in order to actually get it working.
Exactly. And it's pretty complex. So Apollo came along and built Apollo Client, which was a simpler solution that doesn't quite have the same benefits, but from a developer experience standpoint is much simpler. You use query, you put your query in there, and it fetches the data, and it does some caching and works pretty well. And then URQL is kind of a modern re-implementation of Apollo Client if you remove all of the cruft and actually build it from scratch with React and suspense in mind. And so I would recommend using URQL nowadays, or Relay if you have the 2 PhDs on your team that can actually understand it.
Yeah. I would say a lot of it depends on like what is your goal with adopting GraphQL. If your goal with adopting GraphQL is to consume this existing GraphQL endpoint as simply as possible, URQL is going to be a really good way to do that. If your goal is to have the best possible story of fetching exactly the right amount of data for every piece of your web app so that everything gets painted in one fetch, start hiring some PhDs because you're all in on Relay. If your company's already using Apollo and you really don't feel like doing a job hunt, sure, keep using Apollo.
Excellent. So I think we could prepare for questions. I just wanted to quickly just thank Andreessen Horowitz for hosting us. Thank you very much. Also wanted to thank Alex, the creator of tRPC, who could not make it in person today. Thank you very much for creating this library. So thank you so much, if you're watching.
Oh yeah, Alex.
Yeah. And thanks, Lee, for
Heckling.
not shouting relay when I asked the question.
I've personally found that every time I try to build some crazy new data solution to like make it so my page loads everything exactly right and does one single fetch, that I'm just rewriting Relay again. And I've only ever seen Relay working properly twice, and one time was Jane Wong, the famous hacker, built the most beautiful Relay setup I'd ever seen in a private repo she let me see once and then restricted my access to because she doesn't want all of the flack of publishing one of the few good public implementations of Relay. And the mobile team at Twitch, which had to rewrite and federate the GraphQL endpoint for Twitch in order to make it work because they were using the Apollo spec, which meant that your user ID and your friend ID were the same number. And Relay requires every ID for everything ever, even if the types are different, to be different, or it dies. So you actually need to go deep to make Relay work. That said, if you're a nerd about data fetching patterns and you want your app to load everything the theoretically best possible way, Relay is a masterclass in data compilation as like a standard. It's super cool stuff. But yeah, don't actually ship it. My website, BWE Live, plug, actually uses Relay. And there's a maintainer on the Relay team who helped me with that. So it's like a pristine version, an alpha version of React. Just not going to touch it for a while. I've never met a person who shipped Relay that didn't contribute to Relay in some way. Fair enough. Cool. Do we have any questions in the audience that we want to? We got one in the third row. Probably use a mic for the recording.
So I was wondering how tRPC manages backwards compatibility. I am uniquely qualified for this question. I filmed part of a video today. I think I'm just going to redo it tomorrow. The concept I referred to is reducing the dimensions of problems. When you're shipping software, there are so many directions every single thing can go. Like theoretically, you could spin up your own metal, build your own services with your own operating system on your own network and your own ISP. You make all yourself. But there's a certain level of compromises we choose to make to allow us to move faster. One of the ones I see us just assuming we have to make, or the other way, like one compromise that you can make that I don't see people making enough is version synchronization and version management. If I have even a long-living service like Ping, and we make backend changes, it's surprisingly simple to update the backend, have a version like ID that gets, or that's in the response every time a client fetches, and if it's out of sync, a little modal comes up saying, hey, your client's out of sync. Click here to refresh. Or you can even just silently do it behind the scenes for them. Swap out the JavaScript and be good to go. Even on mobile, if you go on or into a platform like Expo and React Native, you're able to swap the JavaScript binary on any navigation, any request, anything that happens. And it's pretty trivial to not think about versions if you can go all in on the JavaScript ecosystem. Because the same server that you're requesting that response from can also host the JavaScript that makes the request in the first place, and we can just send you the new JavaScript if you're out of date. So generally speaking, tRPC doesn't think about backwards compatibility. Theoretically, you could build something there, but if you're worried about backwards and forwards compatibility, you're worried about a dimension that tRPC isn't operating within. If you can avoid adding that dimension when you don't need it, you will be very pleased with yourself as a result.
I mean, this goes back to the point of where does tRPC shine? Because ultimately in that setup, if you have a single server and a single client and you control both, You don't really need backwards compatibility outside of browser caching, maybe.
Yep.
But as soon as you have multiple teams, multiple clients that update at different times, then you have to start thinking about backwards compatibility.
Yep.
We got another question. Fit throw a backhand up.
Oh, thank you. I was just going to be loud if they didn't have a mic. So I understand tRPC is for the move fast, to not break things, folks, and GraphQL is for the boomer companies. Boomer is a mindset, not an age.
I would love to be a boomer someday.
Yeah,
That's the
me
goal.
too.
Yeah,
It's a
$20 billion.
mindset, not an age, mindset. Big companies. Now, if you want to use tRPC, if you want to, choose that tool and build on that tool, are there any significant investors in the project? Employing contributors, companies making bets on tRPC, like a burgeoning ecosystem? Because I look at the stars, that doesn't mean anything to me. And the JavaScript ecosystem, front-end ecosystem is like the Wild Wild West. You adopt something, then it dies, or people stop contributing to it. And so I'm just curious about the surrounding ecosystem, because I mostly learned about and appreciated what I heard about tRPC today.
Yeah.
So.
I'm going to take this on in two angles. The first one is that the support itself. I think the support's in a really good spot. We're seeing lots of companies consider adoption. We're seeing support and donations from all over the place. And Alex, the creator of tRPC, has been killing it and building an awesome team of contributors, many of which came from my audience to continue improving and iterating on tRPC. I'm very confident in the state of the project, its funding, and the likelihood that it will continue. All of that said, I think the beauty of tRPC is, again, in its simplicity. Like if GraphQL was to stop being maintained and the GraphQL libraries you were consuming were to slowly get worse over time, you'd be screwed, because moving off of GraphQL is nightmarish. The beauty of tRPC in its simplicity is at any point I could run a code mod that takes all my GraphQL or all my tRPC routers, throws them on new endpoints, and I just query those instead, because in the end, it's just functions. It's a different way to access those functions, but it is just functions in the end. It would be relatively trivial to write a code mod or any form of port, even just copy paste it myself, to access those same functions in an entirely different way. So when you adopt tRPC, you're not locking that code base onto tRPC forever, the same way I've never seen someone move off of GraphQL and have a good time in the process. Moving off of tRPC, if you ever do hit that point, is relatively seamless.
Yeah, we also had a quick shout out to the guild that you had mentioned. Great organization, this group of folks doing open source. So definitely check out some of their projects in their org as well.
Absolutely, the Open Source Raid Guild is an awesome crew.
Any other questions?
I saw Ryan had a question. I want to make sure he gets his.
It's right there. Ryan, yeah, just keep your hand up.
We've kind of established here that there's these ranges, right? You've got GraphQL over here and tRPC. So in a sense, these weren't really overlapping that much. But tRPC is kind of the newer player. And I'm just forward thinking here a little bit. Do you feel like there's other maybe competition with tRPC on that side? If you're talking this monolithic kind of setup, wouldn't that put tRPC kind of in competition with, say, a built-in mechanisms of the frameworks themselves, loaders, server components, that whole side of things? Just kind of curious on thoughts on that.
Absolutely. It's funny that you asked specifically. For those who don't know, that's Ryan Carniato, the creator of Solid.js, who's been working really hard recently on Solid Start. I find that a lot of what tRPC did is set a new floor for the quality of calling backend code and front-end code when both are in the same code base. Now that this floor has been established, you have to be at least this tall to pass. What we're seeing is frameworks that have more control over the backend and front end do crazy new things using compilers, using new file syntax to give you a similar type-safe, inferred, backend called, front-end used experience without having to adopt tRPC specifically. And there's a lot of cross-pollination in these communities. I know people from tRPC who contribute to Solid Start and vice versa. And I know that a lot of the tRPC contributors have actually been contributing to Remix to help them learn TypeScript, which is really cool to see tRPC teaching the whole web dev community that TypeScript is indeed real and we should actually consider it. All that said, I think ultimately, there would ideally be a point where tRPC is obsolete because every full stack framework has properly adopted good ways to call backend code in the front end. I just don't think that's a reality we'll ever get to. So as such, tRPC will always be some level of baseline experience for calling your backend code and your front end code. Yes.
tRPC is like the coffee script.
Yep.
I don't like comparisons to CoffeeScript. CoffeeScript died a terrible death. This has been an amazing conversation. Fantastic answers from both of you. It's been painted by the audience. This is React.js. Very web-focused, very JavaScript-focused. Can I hear a little bit of, coming back to maybe some of the key questions for anyone who's working on a team that has mobile developers, which is maybe a majority of us, or certainly a majority of the developer ecosystem?
There better be a really good reason they're not using React Native.
React Native is great. It unfortunately has not taken over native development yet.
Yeah, and again, this would come down to like the team problem, where like the team dynamic is one where they're not getting along, they're not aligned or agreed, at which point GraphQL makes a lot of sense. That said, one of the like fights I got into the most at Twitch was that it was irresponsible for us as a company to not be shipping React Native because we could not keep up with our own users and their needs. If there's a day where we want to do a crazy event and change the background color to like highlight a creator that we're working with, we better know that 2 months in advance so that our release cycle can get through Apple's like 2-week review. And the whole team was architected, and the whole process architected around other dependencies in other companies, hopefully not blocking us too much from getting the thing we need to our users. And on top of that, many of our clients being super out of date, hitting old endpoints, hitting backwards compatible things that we haven't used anywhere else for 7 years, but somebody just hasn't updated their iPhone 4's version of the Twitch app. I think that continuing to ship in this way, if you don't have to, is irresponsible. But the beauty of GraphQL is that it lets you not worry about irresponsibility over the wall. And if somebody on the other side of that wall is doing something stupid, you can work around it. If you can keep them from doing something stupid, then you should use tRPC.
I think ultimately, this goes back to the use cases, right? Once you have a use case where you have multiple clients, where you have different languages on the back end and or the client, that's where GraphQL really shines. And tRPC doesn't make any sense anymore because it's TypeScript, right? So if you don't have TypeScript on either side, it doesn't really make sense anymore. It doesn't really work anymore.
There are efforts for an open API generator for tRPC that will like generate a traditional like Swagger doc API. I don't really think that's super cool. Like, it's awesome that people are putting the work in. It's dope to see. But I think you should, when you design an API, you should design an API. When you're calling backend functions, you should call backend functions.
And I think, just to add one last sentence here, this is where different contexts shine, right? Theo working on Ping, tiny company, shipping as fast as they can. Lee Byron working Facebook, Robinhood now, Watershed, bigger companies that have many clients, many developers working on it. Depending on which context you're in, a different trade-off makes sense. It's really what it boils down to.
Yeah. And the specific argument I was making was that I think it makes more sense to adopt GraphQL than, it makes more sense to move from tRPC to GraphQL than to move from React Native to native for the vast majority of companies, the vast majority of the time. And it's weird to think of a company that wants to use tRPC, but it hasn't moved to React Native yet. That's a hard one for me to swallow, just because React Native is one of the most misunderstood and under-adopted technologies in the space.
Sounds like a whole other panel. But we're actually out of time, so everyone give it up for Max Stoiber and Theo Browne. Thanks so much.
Thank you all. Great convo.
Perfect.